with our zoning. So I just wanted to take a minute. We can just kind of go around, introduce ourselves, just say what committee we're on, and then I'll hand it over to Doug and Al for the main show. I'm Krista Chappell. I'm chair of the town council, and I welcome everyone. Pass it along. Okay.
Matthew Height, I'm a town councilor.
I recommend OAC.
Caitlin Nuzzo, Open Space Committee.
Drew Hersom, OAC.
Tamara Lee-Penard, Planning Board.
Melinda Sheehy, Planning Board.
Al Schaefer with the Open Space Committee, and I'm not used to talking through microphones.
Bob Coleman, Open Space.
Dan McGuire, Council.
Martin Meany, Council.
Michael Foley, Town Manager.
Adam Wilkinson, Gray Resident.
Wayne Wood, Open Space. Ordinance Review Committee.
Okay. I'm just going to hand the mic to Doug, and he'll give some context for tonight. And I just want to say thank you all for making the time to be here tonight also.
Thank you. Thank you, Krista. I'm Doug Webster. I think most of you guys know me. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is what it is. There's a handout that I believe everybody has. Let's see if I can steal this chair. It's a 10-page handout. The first page is the agenda. The second page is a list of abbreviations. The third page, the color map, is what they call the future land use map. It's from the comprehensive plan. The fourth map is sort of a combination map. I call it the intern map because one of our esteemed interns made that for us. And that is sort of an interesting one because it shows the existing zoning as the backdrop, and it also shows the future land use areas outlined with a dark green. And if you flip back to the future land use map, you'll see the same shapes. And so I find it particularly helpful because it shows existing zoning and the future land use areas, and it also shows where the development has occurred. If you look at the little dots there, and I believe, what does it say, 10 to 20, it's about a 10-year span, I believe, that shows, and it's interesting that most of the development tends to be in the southern half of Gray. But I find that a very useful map because it's sort of the present and perhaps where we're headed. And let's see, the fifth page, which we will get to, is a legend for development constraints. It's one of the maps that we're going to be going over, how we compiled it. The sixth page are just a thumbnail sketch, if you will, of the currently envisioned anyway, first draft of the general characteristics of the proposed zoning districts. And then the second portion of the handout, it's 4 pages, are the descriptions in the comp plan of the future land use areas. So hopefully that will help. Sort of as back where I'm supposed to be. Kyle, where should I be here? Right here? Okay, all right. Trying to follow the directions from our technical staff here. More than a year ago, I guess at this point, the town council identified implementing the new. Maybe I shouldn't be here.
It's coming over your laptop here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, by all means.
Turn down the volume.
I'm just trying to remove this from the computer.
Oh, wow.
I don't think I could do that if I tried. If Kyle can't solve it, nobody can.
We're hearing him over this computer.
Yeah.
Oh.
And what kind of shame? It's gone.
Right now we're having.
Yes, existing zone. Thank you. Am I good to go, Mr. Kyle? Okay, great. All's well that ends well. So the council identified, okay, we're rolling again. Thank you, Kyle. The council identified one of their main goals as implementing the new zoning is in the comp plan. In land use land, as I think most people in this room know, there's sort of a hierarchy. There's the Growth Management Act that dictates that towns are supposed to have a comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is supposed to, the Growth Management Act is at the top. The comprehensive plan is in the middle. The comprehensive plan, the comprehensive plan is supposed to be consistent with the Growth Management Act, and your zoning is supposed to be consistent with the comp plan. So it's a hierarchy. Growth Management Act, comp plan, zoning. Right now we have a consistent comp plan, but our zoning is not consistent with the comp plan, so we're working on implementing that zoning. So that's the big picture. That's why we're here. That's the mission. Your main role here tonight is to provide input on the process and comment on the proposed map that I'm working, you will see how got developed. After this introduction, I'd like to talk about some of what I call the foundational maps. Webster, I wrote the dictionary, I can invent words. And then like to step through how we created the base map, and then step through how we created the development constraints map. And both of those maps were utilized to create the proposed new zoning districts that we'll see. So this is the existing zoning map. Flip this here. Many of you are very familiar with this. And I'd just like to emphasize, these are planning level maps. They're not, we have done our level best to be as accurate as we can, but they're planning level. In some prior presentations, oh, you put a zone line right through my house. Well, hopefully we didn't do that, but remember, they're kind of planning level maps. So this is the existing zoning, and just like to plant a seed here that you can see that most of the town is either rural residential and agricultural, RRA, the green, or Lake District. There are really very little differences between the two. The Lake District is predicated on being in the direct watershed of Little Sebago. And if all goes, my current vision with the new zoning is to have the Lake District, what they call an overlay district. Overlay districts can either take away or add to the underlying, if you will, zoning. They can do either. Most people think they can only do one, but they can do both. The current Wellhead 1 and Wellhead 2 for residents that have been around a long time. The Wellhead 2 is right there. Wellhead 1, that's the remnants of what used to be the Aquifer Overlay Zone, which was a very unpopular provision many years ago for those that were here for that. I was not, but I've heard enough war stories about it. The BT1 and BT2 business transition around Hannaford was a change to the comp plan, again, before I got here. And then the current Village Center and Village Center proper is the current growth area right in the middle of town. So if we could go to the future land use, maybe, Al. So this is the future land use map, and there's a copy of this in your handout. And so my job that I was asked to do by originally the prior manager and the prior council was to take this broad brushstroke map, if you will, and put some harder lines on it. one of the important elements of the future land use map is that it was not predicated on property lines. And so there's some, and ideally from a zoning administration perspective, you try to follow property lines as much as possible. You can see from your handout that there are 4 basic types. Getting echoes again. I wonder if it's my position. Maybe it's better if I'm over here. There are 4 basic types of districts shown on the future land use map. The critical rural, general rural, village mixed use growth, and there are a host of what they term transition districts. And you'll see as we step through here that one of the major philosophies, if you will, that I've adopted and what I'm putting on the table tonight is to separate, because right now we have RRA and Lake District. Many years ago before I got here, the rural residential and agricultural, I think they grouped together rural residential and agricultural. I think we're at a point now with the comp plan and where we are development-wise that it's probably appropriate to try to separate those out. Which areas are predominantly rural residential and which areas are predominantly rural and agricultural. And you'll see that as a consistent theme. So let's see. And the last 4 pages of your handout outlines the broad brush vision for each of these transition areas. And I have focused most of my efforts on the residential, and I've done my level best to put some parameters around the transition areas, taking into account, as an example, development constraints. This was one of the understandable objectives on behalf of the council. On-point example is the commercial district down 100 South. The commercial district may go back 500-600 feet, but if that's all a wetland, maybe it shouldn't be zoned commercial because it's not able to be practically used for that purpose. And so that was one of the, and so even though we haven't taken big steps with defining what the uses should be in these various transition districts, we have done our level best to try to define the areas, and they've been given titles, as you'll see, just mostly for discussion purpose, so you can talk about what uses may be appropriate there. And so the last map, if we could switch, Al, thank you. This is also in your handout, and this shows, as I said, that most of the town is currently RRA or Lake District. And one of my favorite examples of why we need some rezoning is the half-acre residential lots just north of Hannaford, Spruce, Adler, residential. Those are in the same exact zoning district as all of the gravel pits on Mayall. This makes no sense to me. So I think it's time that, and we have a new comp plan, so I think that the time is right to address this. So let's see, so we're just about ready. So the first thing that we did is we built the base map. And let's see, Al, I think Al's going to step. Okay. I thought it was over. We need that. Ooh. Okay, thanks. So we started with the base map with the town border, and then we added roads that came in. A lot of people identify with that. Then we added surface waters, not wetlands yet, but surface waters. Then we added parcels. And then we added, and you'll see this throughout, so this is the base map with the future land use polygons. And it got too cluttered to label them. But you can see that you have a copy. So you can see it looks a little bit like a snake nest from afar, but if you zoom into one particular area, I think it's really pretty clear. One of the elements that took, I gotta stop being so close over there, don't I? One of the elements that became clear that we needed to follow up on was to try to make sure that we're showing what we need to show. And so that is the base map. That's how we put together the base map. And you can see the parcels, but they're sort of subtle, if you will. And so that is the base map. Now we're going to show you how we built the development constraints map. And there's a key to this on page 5 in the handout. And so we started with wetlands, which I think Al is working on. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn on the wetland. We're going to turn on each of the development constraints one at a time. And then we're going to get a handout for Susan. So this is Gray Flats that, I gotta be careful, just get too close. Gray Flats that most people are familiar with. You can see the light green on the, I'm gonna need to point somehow. Light green and then the dark green. So the light green is a forested wetland and the darker green is the open portion of the wetland. In general, what we did is the darker shades, this is consistent with wetlands, soils, slopes, everything. Darker shades translate to a more significant development constraint. This is the wetland layer. Now what we're going to do, we'll turn the wetland layer off. And we want to do these one at a time because if you put them all on together, it can be a little bit overwhelming. But they're all significant because they're all development constraints. Oh, sure. Yep. Yep, absolutely. I have my, I'm worried about it because it refracts, and I don't want it to refract in somebody's eyes. So unless I can get close and point up so it goes up to the ceiling, let's not have anyone get hurt at a zoning meeting. Thank you very much. And maybe you could zoom into maybe some representative areas. Is that where you're headed? Yep. Okay. Yep. So maybe. It's the same, I believe it's the same database. Yep. Yeah. I can repeat the question. Sure. Happy to. Happy to. Okay. So the two questions that were posed were, what was the source of the wetland information? And when I was at GP Cog, National Wetland Inventory, and it's also the National Hydrology Data Set that's part of the USDA. And So we're going to turn off the the question is, or the query is a rough idea of the percentage of town that has either open or forested wetlands on it, I believe. I think that's the wonders of modern technology. So, so yeah, you can see that, and I don't know if you want to zoom in to, or just maybe slightly. And we thought that the gray flats would be a good example just because people are very familiar with it. Oh.
You can just repeat that. How refined is this data? I mean, how accurate, do we have a sense of?
It-
I believe I was told by from aerial imagery years
So
ago. And when
the-
they started,
The question is how accurate was the data, and Al's more familiar with the data source.
say it again. It's not engineering data. And it was gathered, I guess, through years of scrutiny of aerial imagery. And I guess I've been told by people at USM that it's pretty darn accurate, but it's not engineering data. It's not survey data.
It's, yeah. Yep. 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 The comment was that the data is a little bit dated. It may have been accurate back then, but in some instances, site conditions change. So that's the soils, and maybe we were going to keep the base on, but in a court. Wetlands, yes, I understand. We were going to keep the base on and go into soils, but if those attending here are interested not necessarily in roads or parcels, but the development constraint, so we could just do the same with soils. I think that's a great idea. And so these are soils, and as per my prior comment, the darker diagonal lines are the very poorly drained soils, and the lighter brown diagonal lines are the poorly drained soils. So again, the darker, the more significant the development constraint. Sure.
I just wonder if we could see the intersection of wetlands and poorly drained soils, because in fact, because poorly drained, very poorly drained soils are often going to be wetlands, even though they're not shown on the NWI maps. So that might be a good indication of how accurate the NWI maps are.
I see. Okay. And it worked. The goal at the end was to turn all of the development constraints on, but we wanted to turn them on one at a time so you could see how the map was developed. So I believe this is both wetlands and soils, poorly drained and very poorly drained together, which I believe was your intent.
Yes. Could we turn off the soils now, just so we can? So my guess is that there's a lot more wetlands when you go on the ground looking for them.
Okay.
You're going to find on that map.
Okay. The comment was that there are likely to be more wetlands on the face of the ground than may be indicated on the map. Smaller ones in particular, I would assume.
I just know that poorly drained soils often conflict with wetlands.
Yes. Yep. It's part of what makes them wetlands. Hydrology, soils, and vegetation. Understood. Army Corps. That's right. So let's see. Slopes. Maybe we could do just. Okay. Okay. So let's just do slopes without the base map, maybe. Yep. Let's do slopes for the entire town, and one of the areas that we thought might be helpful to show, because people are generally familiar with it, is the Libby Hill area. And as it says on your legend in your handout, the lighter red, almost pink grid, this is a grid, those are 10 to 15%. And the brighter, darker grid, like on the left of the screen right there, those are 15 plus. We intentionally chose a different color and a different pattern, a different grid, so it would jump out when all of the development constraints come together.
Yeah, I realize we've got surveyors and engineers in the group here, but a 10% grid means that for every horizontal 100 feet, you have a 10-foot rise vertically, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here.
So those are slopes. Oh, so yeah. Yep. So sure. That's a good question. So the question is, what are the common development constraints associated with different steep slopes? The plumbing code, I know, to have what they call passing soils for a wastewater disposal system, I think that's either at 15 or 20. It's been a while, but you can't get a passing wastewater disposal field if it's too steep. It presents challenges for house construction, particularly foundations and drainage. And it also creates challenges for stormwater as well. I mean, if you have a driveway that's going up a steep slope, that can cause a lot of stormwater to go right down to the road. And so that's the residential side. On the commercial side, they're generally even more significant because you tend to have more impervious and you're disturbing more area. So those are the most common. That's a good point. Thank you. And you can see we still have the future land use. We did our level best. We thought it important to keep the future land use areas shown throughout, because those are the foundation for the new zoning. Do you have a question, Wayne?
Your net residential land use calculations in all of the planning stuff that we do, what's the upper limit on your slopes in that? That you deduct out?
NRA, NRG. So net residential, the question is the deducts for area net residential density. When any type of subdivision comes to the planning board for approval in accordance with state statute, as compared to a lot that's outside of subdivision, any lot in a subdivision needs to conform with what we call NRA, NRD, net residential area, net residential density. And I believe it's beyond 15%. It's either 10 or 15. I don't have it. It's in 401.13.16, but I don't remember the number. So yes, how does it compare? Because I believe your point would be, how does this data affect a development that might go in? I believe what happens is there's a 50% deduct. I wrote it, but it was a couple years ago. There's a 50% deduct, I believe, for a relatively minor slope, and then I believe there's a 100% deduct for a slope that exceeds, it's either 15 or 20%. But that's what we call a net residential area, net residential density, and the reason that it's particularly relevant, as Mr. Wood is pointing out, is that it affects the number of lots that a developer is able to realize, which affects their bottom line for their input costs for the project. So it's in. So 25% and above is 100% deduct. I thought there was a 50%, maybe not. 50%. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Okay. Counselor?
Doug, is this LiDAR information? What's the source for this data? It's not LiDAR.
It, the, the, I think it's the, 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 the question is, what is the source of the slope data? And it could be USGS, and in some instances, the last letter, as you're probably aware, on the 74 Cumberland County Medium Intensity Soil Survey, the last letter of the soil type will dictate the slope, which was presumably predicated on either the 7.5 or the 15-minute series. So there's no 50%, I guess. Okay. But that's a good point, Mr. Wood, that maybe we should be looking at perhaps a third type of slopes for the purposes of helping developers realize what the potential impact is on a particular site. Okay. So the last development constraint is DEP and IF&W state protected areas. And they're to be including known vernal pools. It's not a huge prevalence. It's a couple vernal pools, and I believe the area over by the Pleasant River was an area where. So Al's working on turning those on, I think. Okay, I thought there were more over by the river. There they are. Okay, now they're showing up. Okay. Sometimes what happens with these layers is they either don't show up or they become much more clear if you zoom into a more.
You have to forgive me. I'm a little bit colorblind, so I can't tell you what color that is. I really don't know. It's not quite dark. It's not quite light. But the small circles are the vernal pools. The larger area you see there, it kind of cuts north and south through the eastern corner of the town. That's what they call an ETSC area. And that's an area where the state has recognized endangered, threatened, or species of concern. They don't say what's there, and it doesn't really matter. I think the town only has that one area. Of course, this is the heron rookery that's up behind the gravel pits. There's another heron rookery here. The heron rookeries do come and go too. They're not nearly as constant as, say, elevation or wetlands and things like that. And there are other zones, but this was the most important one. And this is from the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Department has something called Beginning with Habitat, and they have layers, GIS layers of all kinds of different issues associated, and all available free for the town, any town to have. And we've got those too, in case they come up or there's something we want to look at.
Okay, so do you guys want to see all of the development constraints? Would that help? Just to bring it on, she says. She's not afraid to be very afraid. And probably if we can see the whole town, maybe we can. Yep, great. My sense is no. Okay. Yep, we can turn on and off layers, whatever the whim of those attending is. So. Susan.
I'm not sure exactly how you identified one area that was protected. It was just land protected. I mean, not for animals or any species. Is that over in East Gray, where towards the Pineland campus? Is that? I know there's a lot of protected stuff up there. Nothing's going to happen for quite a long time. I can't tell on that map which way.
North is straight up, and there was an area that had some IF&W/DEP protection along the Pleasant River. I think that may be your question. Royal River. Thank you, Mr. And so again, what we did is we utilized when we were drawing the proposed district boundaries on a map, we had the cumulative development constraints, and we had the future land use areas, and I actually used aerial photography too, with a Google Earth and that type thing, to be able, if there was a question about which side, as an example, a property should, which portion of a property should be in. So that was and together with the ground truthing, with the example that I utilize with the commercial area for, as an example, Portland Road going on 100 South. So let's go back to the base map if we can, Al. And pretty much in line with where I think the comprehensive plan guidance started, and again, we're keeping the future land use areas shown up there. I started with the what's on the future land use map as critical rural, and I'm proposing, obviously it's not up to me, but I'm proposing that those areas be called rural conservation. From my perspective, the title of a zoning district should be as descriptive as possible of what that district comprises. What is the general characteristic of that zoning district? And I think critical rural works very well in the comp plan, but I'd propose that maybe it be considered to be called rural conservation. So let's go back to the base map. Let's get rid of all the development constraints. Base map, and let's add the rural conservation. So this is how the map was put together. So there is the rural conservation, and you can see that. And again, as I pointed out before, when the future land use map was put together for the comp plan, they didn't, to the best of my knowledge anyway, they did not utilize property lines. And so in an attempt to look at existing development and development constraints, that's why there's some deviation. Some of these areas that you're going to see are going to be what I call white, because they aren't defined yet. So Councillor Height has a question.
Isn't there another rural conservation at the bottom?
There should be. Yep. Sorry. So those are the rural conservation areas. Tried to follow property lines. We did consider development constraints. They're generally larger parcels with little or no development. And per the comp plan in your handout, the goal was strong protection with very limited development. The central gray critical rural area is a particularly large area. So that's what I'm proposing, at least for the first draft, as rural conservation. And and then the next one that I worked on was what I termed rural and agricultural. And you can see that in many instances the RA, rural and agricultural, comes quite close to the RC. And you can see it along Mayall Road and some of the larger blocks and relatively low development along the eastern shore of Little Sebago Lake, as well as up the far end, if you will, of North Raymond Road. So that's, again, as I touched upon earlier, my goal was to try to separate out the predominantly rural and agricultural from the rural residential. Councillor?
How did you define the agricultural areas? How did you discover those?
A lot of it was, I looked at development constraints, and I also, as I alluded to before, I kept Google Earth up on the computer screen as I was drawing the lines on the map. And so you can see a lot of the Some of the pine land, I think, is in RC. As I said a minute or so ago, there will be some areas, there's some areas that I'm not sure what they should be, and those are going to be left blank. So simply because you see some white blanks here does not necessarily mean, that might be an area where we need some more input. And so that's, it could be, what the question is, what could agricultural be? Trees, gravel pits, farmland, more generally lower density, generally larger parcels, particularly those that might be adjacent to the RC, as an example. So mostly it was related, it was density and existing use driven, if that helps.
As I hear Doug talk, I really get tempted to turn the parcels back on. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the parcels on. I think it might help when he's trying to describe how he decided what zone should go where.
Yeah, so if you go in, if we could zoom in just a little bit right there, maybe, Al, you can see how there was an attempt to balance, if you will, the guidance that was provided in the comp plan with the future land use line versus the actual property line and the existing land use. I know it's not an exact science. Neither is code enforcement, actually. A lot of people think it is, but it's not. So maybe we could zoom out a little bit, maybe see the whole town somehow. Yeah, including down. Is there a way we can? Does it get too small if we go all the way down to there? So that is the proposed rural and agricultural. And okay, so let's turn on the rural residential now. And so those are areas that are existing or adjacent to relatively dense, from a rural perspective, residentially developed areas, generally subdivisions. And one of the policy calls that I think we need some more input on is, yeah, right there. I mean, if you have an existing subdivision that's in the middle of relatively low development, should that be zoned rural residential? Should the town take on, if you will, the responsibility of trying to protect the predominantly residential nature of this parcel relative to that parcel? I think that's an important policy decision. And let's see, maybe we could see maybe back up a little bit, Al, if you will, to see the balance. And there's over here, adjacent to Sebago, you can see you sort of have a couple different things happening. You've got the RC and then the RA, but you have pockets of existing subdivisions. And so I think there's some policy questions about how, as I said, is the town supportive of making that distinction and taking proactive steps within the confines of the new zoning standards for those districts to be a little bit more protective of the predominantly residential nature of those areas, even though they may not necessarily be adjacent to a residential area. And are there areas that anybody wants to zoom in on here? Or?
Is it a best practice when you are creating zones, and we're in the preliminary stages, that you might have little islands Or do you try and sort of have like a section and a section, or would you have like pockets that are depending on slopes? And we're making the sausage now. It sort of occurs to me how messy it is because you have existing development that you want to not make non-conforming. So when we do this, we're probably going to end up with pockets.
Yes, very good question. There are likely to be pockets, I think, and one of the approaches, or one of the questions with the approach, is how strongly does the town feel about trying to keep these areas predominantly agricultural? And it can do that by changing the standards for the RA, as an example, as opposed to the RR. Another approach would be if one or more of, can we go down over here, Al? That area is, I wrestled with that a lot. A little bit further. A little bit right here. So this is I had a lot of trouble with this one, and I'm happy to be corrected. I believe I left it white. But so you have an existing relatively dense residential subdivision, but it's surrounded by large parcels. And so I think that's a textbook example of the question that you're posing. And one approach would be to look at the surrounding area and this pocket and say, okay, and together with the development over the past 15 years on the map that shows the new houses in your packet, and say, okay, let's zone this, let's zone all of this RR. So there are a couple. It's a very good question, and some of those areas you'll see we don't have that many more layers left. Some of those areas I've left white, meaning I'm not sure what should happen there, but I do think there should be some consistency. I think it's a really good question. So I think the last area, what is the last one? Let's see, residential, and I think that's the yellow. Those are areas that are quite, from Gray's perspective anyway, quite dense, and so again, it begs the policy question on behalf of the town. Is the town supportive of adopting zoning that limits the uses of these existing relatively densely residentially developed areas to be residential, so that uses that are inconsistent with that don't go in there? From one perspective, it is appropriate because it's part of the town, but it's an important policy decision because there are likely to be cases where the town needs to pursue enforcement if there are some commercial uses that come in there. But on the other hand, it's the town protecting the predominantly residential nature of those areas. So, maybe we could zoom out and see where the other areas are. I think I did Maplewood, Dry Mill, yeah, at least part of it. There's a big part of the Marie Street and opposite Shawbrook and so forth. That just, there's a larger policy question, at least in my brain anyway, with Dry Mills, but that area, it already is residential, it's already small lots, you're not going to change that. So that was the reasoning, if you will, behind the residential. And I think, are the transition districts all together? Okay, so let's turn those on. And so, as I alluded to in the beginning here, what I tried to do here was to take into account development constraints and at least put labels. Portland 1, these are all after road names, of course. Portland, Lewiston, Yarmouth. And I did take the liberty, maybe we could go up a little bit, Al, just a teeny bit. I did take the liberty, and obviously there's going to be a lot of discussion about a lot of this work, I understand. You can see that the future land use map in the comp plan had the Yarmouth Road transition area ending here. it made sense to me to extend it. That's Depot right there, and that's Short Mayall. And so I labeled them intentionally so that there could be some discussions about them. And the broad brush, back to the prior manager, I was asked to start on the outside of town, if you will, and work my way in with the vision that principal and other consultants would be working on the village. And then once we had a vision for where the village was heading, and we had a pretty good idea what was happening on the outer periphery of town, we would be able to fill in the transition zones. That was the vision many months ago, and I don't mean to rain on anyone's parade, but that's what happened. Those were kind of my marching orders, if you will, at the time. And so you can see, if we could zoom out a little bit, Al, and show the whole town, if there's a way to do that. So you've got the village core, maybe a little bit. Can we zoom in a little bit? We wrestled with that because it shows more detail. Yes. We have 4. Yeah, I was hoping to kind of go through the question was, can we turn the map? And maybe we could just kind of go through. We have the 4 different sectors. That's probably a good way to go. So here's a textbook example right here of, okay, what happens with this parcel? Should this become RA? Should the line be here? Should the green come down to there? And then we have the same question that was posed right there. That's there's that Chestnut Heights, I believe. No, that's Mike Cobb's. And here's Yarmouth 1, Yarmouth 2. And I attempted to have the comment was, what will happen with the uses in the respective districts because of the potential or likely impact for property values. And in an attempt to at least paint a broad brush for the purposes of sparking discussion, in the handout on page 6, maybe, the colors correspond. Yes, page 6. Yep, Adam's got it there. I attempted to put some lot size ranges with some very general conceptual at this point. Obviously, this is the first draft. Sure, completely understandable. But though the lot sizes ranges, I believe they are, together with some of the sample uses, was my first blush attempt to put some parameters on the differences between them, if for no other purpose than to spark discussion. So again, these are Yarmouth 1, Yarmouth 2. This was a question. Let's see, what sector is next, Mr. Al? South Gray, okay. Talked about this one a little bit earlier. Oh, and I didn't mention, we didn't touch shoreland. The vision at this point is shoreland is not going to be affected. Within the last 3 years, there's been a pretty major overhaul of Chapter 402 and the accompanying map, shoreland zoning. Shoreland zoning around ponds is 250 feet. For streams that are subject to stream protection, it's a 75-foot setback. Because we recently revisited shoreland, and because in gray, shoreland zone is its own district. It is not, repeat, not. It is not an overlay. It is its own set of standards, which is one of the hornet's nest that a campground many years ago got caught in the middle of because they had two different ordinances regulating the same piece of property, which was, I think, very sad. But in any event, shoreland is not proposed, at least at this point, and obviously up to the council, but I would advocate that shoreland doesn't really need to be changed because it's been fairly recently reviewed. And so that's why, it just caught my eye, that's why that shows up as white. So the white is not because I'm being indecisive, it's as I am here, but not the shoreland. Shoreland is dictated by the state. So that's, and this is a good question, I think, over here. Should that be RC? Should that be RA? So, Counselor.
Was there any thought to try to connect the southern and the central regions?
The question was there any thought about connecting the southern and central? I assume you mean the rural conservation. I didn't explore that. The sequence of the layers that I outlined here tonight, I really tried to follow the comp plan as much as possible. I don't think that's out of the question, but it would be a pretty significant policy question, particularly for the property owners that were in the middle. I really tried hard to adhere to the lines on the future land use map, deviating, as I've said, with development constraints, existing land use, and what's the third one? And lost it. So, and although we don't have super specifics yet for what the potential commercial uses might be for these different transitions, I tried to put some good parameters on those. And so I have, let's see, where is that? I gotta find that. So the comprehensive plan has some very broad brush. It's in your packets on pages 7 through 10. The comprehensive plan has some broad brush guidance with regards to the different transition areas. And in terms of commercial development, as we've talked about, one question is what's going to happen with the village, which has a bearing on what happens with the transition zones. I've got to find that thing. But it's conceivable. I'm looking. I had some great notes on this. I can't seem to find them. I'll have to wing it. So, one way to go about this is looking at the town from a commercial perspective is what are the different commercial uses that the town would like to have? Part A. Part B, where would those go? Which of those commercial uses would you like to see in the village? And it could be that maybe each of the five, I call them the five spokes, each of the five spokes, if you will, has their own sort of flavor, if you will. And so maybe the Portland Road, P1, P2, I thought there was a P3. Maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, there is a big P3, that's right. Maybe Portland Road, because of the commuter traffic, maybe that gears more, if that is to be commercial, maybe that's geared more towards retail. And so that would be the predominant land use along that corridor. And maybe, as another example, West Gray 1 through 4. Maybe West Gray is a little bit heavier commercial because it minimizes the number of existing residences that are adversely affected by heavier traffic. and it's close to the turnpike. And so that's kind of, from my perspective anyway, that's one way to approach this is, again, what are the different types of commercial uses that we're looking for the purposes of diversifying the tax base? And then exploring where those might most appropriately be located, taking into account the village and the respective 5 spokes, and come up with a concept, sort of an overall plan, if you will, to try to encourage, direct the type of commercial development that we're looking for into the respective area. And so that's why I tried to, and again, that's mostly why they're labeled, mostly for purposes of discussion.
The council has a lackluster history in choosing good spots for commercial development. We put a 16-inch main down the Portland Road for the water park that's down there now. Hannaford came to town and said, we'll build a store in Gray, but it's got to be between Libby Hill Road and North Raymond Road. So we changed our zoning to make that happen. I do worry about parsing it too finely and not having a process that's more flexible, that sort of takes into consideration or gives people an opportunity to propose something where they'd like to put it, if you will, just for that reason. Because I mean, we could say we want what we want up there, and people are going to come to town with a completely different set of ideas. So I think we have to be careful about being too restrictive that way.
Was to the point about the kind of the spot zones all over the place, scattered all over, was there consideration of combining the rural zones together to just be one zone and combining those standards, leave the rural conservation because it's more unique, but combine rural and agricultural and rural residential to be just a basic rural zone? So you have the critical rural zone, a rural zone, almost more to match the future land use plan as it is, and then to Dan's point, using those transition zones and village mixed use zones to have some maybe broader brush zones that allow for more flexible development opportunities.
Thank you. Yep, that's a good point. And actually, I had in an earlier version of this map, I had the area, what is that, Long Hill over here. I had all that as rural residential. It's always easier to be more general and less specific, and I definitely think that's something that should be looked at. The intention was to try to separate out, as an example, the gravel pits that are predominantly on like Mayall. But to your point, there's a gravel pit that received a lot of critical review at the time. There's a gravel pit on LeGros, and that's a residential area. I think that's an important policy question, is that are the residents of Gray, because that's the way it's written right now, are the residents of Gray comfortable having a gravel pit in a low density rural residential area? But some of the early versions of this, I did have that. I had it more general, and I downshifted, if you will, to trying to advocate that the town have some level of protection for the areas that are existing predominantly residential, particularly the subdivisions. And then, of course, if OAC had anything to say about it, OAC would say, well, a lot of that's taken care of with the civil deed covenants. And so there are arguments on both sides. That's, I guess, how I would respond to that. So.
One thing we haven't talked a lot about is this and I don't know a lot about this, the old lake zone, but it appears to be based on watershed, and I presume that the uses and restrictions in that zone are tailored to protect water quality. Or, I'm just wondering.
They were intended to. I
Yeah.
don't think they went. I think they were intended to. I don't know if they went as far as they perhaps should have, and I believe the council is supportive of looking at some watershed standards for that. And as I alluded to before, my proposal is to have the direct watershed as an overlay, as a separate, as compared to a separate district.
Two things. One, I agree with Dan, because my experience over 40 years in dealing with zoning is that economic opportunity comes and you never know where it's going to be. It's just the circumstances. And this, so I think there's a need for flexibility. But the other piece here, and this is sort of reminiscent of my traveling from West Gray into Gray this morning, was I wound up waiting somewhere in the order of 7 to 10 minutes and getting through the 3 lights from 202 into the town. So my thinking is that what we really have to look at and say to ourselves, thinking not just a few years down the road, but maybe 25 or even 50 years down the road, how wide are we going to make these roads, and how many driveway cuts are going to be put in that will impede the pass-through. Now, the reason I say this, back in the late 80s, I went to Canberra, Australia, and what amazed me about that, and that city was kind of designed by an architect, the same one who did Pineland. He had put pods of uses together with very fast-moving roads in between these pods. So you'd have a pod of residential development. You might have a pod that would be reminiscent of a village of small commercial establishments. And then there was another pod where all the government buildings were. So everything was easy access. It was quick. When I think back to this goes back when I first moved to Maine in 1970. The impression of Gray was, gee whiz, it's filled with a bunch of gas stations and roads that you go through. And so I would say, and this is, I think, really helpful, what has been put together by Doug and Al, is to let's take a look at roadways and travel through and looking at 25 years hence, because I'd hate to see happen here what's happened if you look at Massachusetts. And it's congested. All you do is get yourself involved in traffic, and I know the comp plan mentions rural character, but that's fastly disappearing.
Thank you, Larry. Other comments, or? Yep, here we go.
I'm just wondering, I think it was last summer, the summer before, where we did all that work in the village to talk about how do we want to realign roads, change the village character, change the roads. Where is that, and are you incorporating the work that was done there in this zoning? Because that was a lot of work. We had a consultant, and Post-its and everything.
Yep, and so as I mentioned earlier, the direction that I was provided was to start on the outside and work in, and then the vision was that those that are more integrally involved with the village, the principal group and the town working collaboratively with DOT, was going to work on the village, and we're going to try to bring those together. So yep, and so that's a work in that's a work in progress. I did spend quite a bit of, that's right, that's right. I did spend quite a bit of time without knowing what the uses might be, trying to put together like the Yarmouth 1 and Yarmouth 2 in a logical, thinking about the existing land use, the roads, the curb cuts, and so forth. Tried to at least put areas that belong together in the same title, if you will. So,
Doug, can you talk a little bit about the rationale for following property lines? Because you started out with what I thought was a great presentation of here are all the restrictions, you know, slopes and vernal pools and wetlands and all of that. But those boundaries, if you will, don't follow property lines. And I look at this and I see all over this map, I see parcels side by side that are different colors. If you're on this side of the line, it means this. If you're on that side of the line, it means that. As opposed to if you're within 200 feet of a lake, you can't do X or you can't do Y, which makes sense to me. You know, if you think about a parcel that is, I don't know, a 100-acre parcel that's got 50 acres that are flat, that has no criteria, doesn't meet any of your, if you will, your restrictions, but the back 50 acres wetland, for example. And then we come along and sort of arbitrarily say, well, the entire parcel is in or not in. In other words, trying to follow parcel boundaries as opposed to the boundaries of the actual land, you know, vernal pools or whatever. Can you just defend that, if you will, for a minute?
and now maybe we could turn on the development constraints. And from an administration perspective and from a development perspective, it gets very, it can be done, obviously, it is done, but it can be complex to administer, as an example, a subdivision that's in 2 different zoning districts. And so ideally, they're one. The differences, if you look at page 6 of the handout that describes the districts, as an example, and to your comment about, okay, you're on one side of the line, you're in RR versus RA, I don't think the differences are going to be super significant, I think. The vision, I tried to outline it in the handout. RA is intended to be a little bit looser. The parcels are generally larger. It's probably more realistic that you might be able to have some commercial uses on the parcels, gravel pits, as an example, in the RA district, because if there were, you have the ability to be set back from the property line, as an example, if you have enough acreage. The development constraints were, we could go down, maybe down to the south here. I did look pretty hard. You can, there's a good example. So the development constraints were looked at in quite a bit of detail when a parcel, it was a combination of development constraints and trying as often as possible to have one parcel in one district. So I don't know if that's a answer or.
Yeah, I mean, it helps. But just one other comment. From an open space committee member perspective, I don't want to speak for the entire committee, but the idea of having larger lots in rural, critical rural areas doesn't feel right to me, because that causes, if you will, sprawl into these areas. if a landowner has 200 acres in one of these rural conservation, critical rural conservation, and he or she now have to do larger lots, you end up having to put roads further into this critical rural area, as opposed to the other approaches. If there's already one road there, having smaller lots there in exchange, and we talk about this all the time within the Open Space Committee, in exchange for the permanent preservation of open space or rural conservation land. So just as a general comment, this idea of a 5-acre lot in a rural conservation, yeah, you might have less overall houses, but you're going to go into those areas further as land becomes more and more scarce and more valuable, if you will, over time. So 50 years from now, all of our rural conservation areas are going to have houses that are all spread through them. So just a comment.
It's a good comment. Get just a sec, Dan. And I maybe should have titled this density instead of lot size. That's my bad. That was the vision. The vision was to try to create some distinction. And the other concept that I believe that has been kicked around at OAC and maybe even in open space was that in this proposed rural conservation district, even though the density may be in that range, let's say for argument's sake, the 3 to 5, maybe there's a requirement in there that limits the developed portion of that lot. So I guess I would suggest that simply because and I shouldn't have called it lot size, I meant density is what I meant. And there could be some performance standards that work towards achieving the goals that you outlined that are right in line with the comp plan and the at least my impression of where we're headed with that zoning district.
In defense of Doug's choice to choose property lines as dividing for the zoning, I'll give you the classic example of Wellhead 2 zone, which is a very irregular shape. Some very high-powered mathematicians can probably tell you exactly what those boundaries are. Beyond that, ain't nobody going to figure it out. And I get paid a lot of money to do that for when those zoning lines go through the middle of a lot. So you're going to spend a lot of taxpayers' money to define a line that goes around all these various different constraints and call it a zoning line. They are not easily recognizable by anybody except the professionals that you're going to pay a lot of money to have us do it. So I'm a strong advocate of following property lines as best you can. Like your shoreland zoning, it's 250 feet back from the edge of the water. While it's irregular, it's a defined entity that you can follow fairly well. Streams, I can tell you what everybody can walk along the stream and tell you what 75 feet away from it is. Those are things you can deal with. That wellhead zone, good luck trying to find that. That's all I got to say.
Yeah, I don't want to sort of take the conversation in a different direction. I think that those are the details that have to get sorted out. You know, I could envision that where there's a border, you know, people would be able to make a case one way or another that they, you know, have a use that should allow them to be across the street or whatever. I think using streets to some extent helps a little bit. Mail Road's a good example. If you can go back to that piece and you see that white piece that's undefined, we know that all of the streams and most of the streams and rivers in town are stressed in one way or another. And you know, we've done some work along those lines and we want to do some more, but that white spot there, you know, I would put that all in the critical rural area right up to Mail Road, to be honest with you, for the most part. And if we have a mechanism whereby people can challenge the process and make a case for themselves, if there's little indentations here and there and the edge of these zones become jagged because of that process, we're not starting with a blank sheet of paper. We're not going to make the lots that we have go away. So I think to win support from the majority of people, and we had a good majority of people that supported the foundation of the comp plan, I think to keep that, I think we're going to have to do some horse trading back and forth as to what we end up with for the rules. But I agree, I think in the critical rural areas, you know, the allowance becomes the denser you build, the more credit you get, the more space you leave behind. You know, we find something that's appealing to the developer that we can give in exchange for that. I think those are the kinds of things that will help us keep those areas the way we want them to be.
Anybody else? Any other comments? Oh, Larry, great.
In listening to Doug suggest that we should use density, I think that's definitely the way to go, and it follows your comment because it's reminiscent to me. I once went up to Prince Edward Island, and up there they have 5-acre zoning. Well, what exactly happened is what your fear was. So I think maybe we kind of define maybe the districts in terms of what we want for density, using Dan's approach with some flexibility. And typical of zoning ordinances is exceptions that are based on on-ground study and presentation, so that at least you don't compromise the owner of the parcel.
On the shirt tails of that, but maybe we could have a density requirement and somehow figure out the frontage and lot size, because those are the typical Euclidean tools, but maybe have some performance standards with some bonuses that work towards achieving the goals of in the rural conservation district, if you will, to an incentive, the carrot approach. I'm sorry. I'm gonna go back to Larry here.
Just real quick, when I was living in New Gloucester and on the committees there relative to zoning, we put in what we called a conservation density subdivision. And it was strictly based on density. By lowering the density, you could have more of a driveway with road using turnouts rather than 2-lane roads and preserving much more land area. But again, the question is incentives, because how do you do that?
I guess the question that I have, well, first off, thank you so much. This is a tremendous amount of work, and I really appreciated all the work that it's gone into this. The question that I have is in regards to our water resources, and particularly our lakes that are quite sensitive. 250 feet shoreline zoning is awesome, and it's great that we have that. And I'm just curious about, it's that second and third tier of development that can really start to have much larger impacts on the water quality. So I'm just curious what we're thinking in terms of the watershed as a whole.
And the council had about 8 weeks ago, had a presentation about that, and they were supportive of pursuing anyway a grant to look at some was it in the building codes? Prescriptive, two different approaches to watershed. One would be the prescriptive approach, where you have some specific standards for you allocate your phosphorus pounds per acre, and then there's the prescriptive approach that you follow to try to minimize that the phosphorus and the stormwater runoff. But if you chose to deviate from that, you could hire your engineer to do that, and so. At least discussions as of a few years ago were to consider adopting these stormwater phosphorus standards, at least initially, in the shoreland zone, and then work your way out. So I think the council, I'm happy to be wrong about this, but I believe the council is supportive of that, and they are working towards that. So that's a help.
I mean, that's essentially the Lake District becoming an overlay district is what we're sort of talking about, right? Because when you talk about watersheds, you know, like everywhere is in a watershed, but are we talking about lake watersheds specifically? Yeah.
My understanding, I always feel uncomfortable talking for the council. I believe the council's intention was to start with the shoreland areas of all of the great ponds, and all of the water bodies in the town, and then use that as the training wheels and work our way out.
To the watershed boundary.
Yeah. Just a quick background on that. The Resiliency Committee worked with the council to apply for a grant, a community action grant, under the Governor's Office of Policy and Innovation, at GoPIF, and so we should hear back in another week or so. And that purpose of that would be multifold, but in part to create a watershed management plan town-wide, and then also to do some public education, public awareness raising around, like, what's a watershed? Do I live in one? What should I be doing with that? And then as part of that work, not funded by the grant, but something we kind of committed to doing as a council, was to work on updating it wasn't really a zoning district so much as, but that's something that Town of Wyndham and Town of Falmouth have both used for Little Sebago Lake successfully to reduce phosphorus loading, and they've actually seen phosphorus levels go down since they instituted this. So that's just a quick background on that.
Thank you, Ann. I always feel uncomfortable talking about you guys make the rules. I follow them.
For your critical rural areas, the city of Auburn, just to our north, has a unique zoning district for their agricultural land in South Auburn that says you have 10-acre minimum lot size, and if you want to build a house on that lot, you're going to generate 50% of your income from the land. I looked at a very large piece of land up there before I built my house. I couldn't build a house and farm it because I couldn't guarantee 50% of my income from the land. My surveying business was going to generate more income than the farming would, and it prevented me from doing that. Now, I am a farmer. I have animals, livestock, and a farm. So I was willing to do everything else they want, and as I understand it now, that zoning district is under extreme pressure from City Hall to get changed. But currently, it is very effective at keeping houses out of that area.
I guess, sadly, including yours. Sorry. Sorry. Any?
So another piece that I'm curious about is, so thank you in terms of answering the question regarding lake watersheds. The reality is all land is in a watershed. So when I'm just curious whether or not there's an exercise to build out based on this zoning and what that actually looks like, and in particularly like in small stream watersheds, like how much impervious surface will be. There's a lot of studies around impervious surface and water quality and the balance of that. So it would just be interesting to understand what the projected build out is.
Yeah, I don't think we haven't gotten that far with this. I think it's a good point. And Gray is arguably a little bit behind some of the, like the Falmouth and so forth. Wyndham has had standards for 4 years, I believe, plus or minus. And again, the approach is to have the prescriptive option that minimizes the cost for property owners. But if you want to get creative, great, hire your own engineer, meet the performance specs. Conceptually similar to the building code that says, okay, you can build a foundation exactly this way, or you can get a PE stamp on it. So I think that's the approach. So So comment is we're trying to at least start the discussion and get some standards on the books, because those, and then over time have them be more thorough. So any other comments here, or?
Just a process question for the evening. You started earlier on talking about these pockets that you were having a hard time defining based on particularly for the residential areas that have pockets of development and then a more open space around them. Would you like input specifically on those areas that you're having a harder time defining, or what would you like from us in regards to that this evening?
I think it would be helpful. It'd be helpful from my perspective. We have the problem children area, if you will, predominantly for the residential. Probably one of the poster, the rural residential. It's down a little bit, maybe, Al. Sort of some guidance on areas such as this. The area up to the north that was up to the resource, to the rural conservation. And then I think the other question, and so that hopefully will, if there can be some agreed upon standard practices to resolve those problem areas, input and consensus ideally, that I would like to think that we'd be pretty close to the outer part, if you will, of the residential, predominantly residential zoning. But I think the larger, the commercial question needs to be answered as well. And this is arguably a good audience and good time to plant that seed, as I did before. You know, what is it that the town would like to see if the town is still committed to trying to diversify the tax base and include some more commercial? What types of commercial uses are we talking about? And should it be more of a blanket, or should it be more directed? It strikes me that we need closure to both the unanswered questions for the residential as well as the commercial component. If we can keep those going while the discussions move forward with the village, I'd like to think that that's on parallel tracks, if you will. I'd like to think that that's probably the fastest timeline to try to get something like this on the books and in front of the council. A workshop, I'm happy to work with OAC. I guess I would, not to spin the tables, I would ask the council if the council wanted input on that first, or the alternative would be for me to work with OAC and maybe open space, and then bring something to the council for your consideration. Okay, you guys are the council. I'm the hired help. I get it. So I could work with OAC on these areas and any fine tuning, and obviously with input from open space, and then bring a slightly more refined version of this to you at a future, I'm thinking out loud here, at a future workshop for your consideration. If that's okay. Okay.
I can save it for OAC. It's about that problem area. So I had a thought of how to deal with that, but if we're going to deal with it in OAC, I'm happy to leave it until then.
But truth is, I didn't want to go. I mean, I could have put colors on the whole town, but that's not. We're talking about making the future land use map, which in the comp plan. So I wanted to make sure that I was on the right track with this before I went too far. And I appreciate all the comments.
So I used to work for a retailer. I used to work for Hannaford, and I think that companies, retailers, even commercial, industrial, they're constantly changing where they want to be. They don't know today. They think they never want to be there, and then they change their mind. So what Dan said is just well-founded. We are not going to be able to predict it. I will say that to the one thing that we could do, and I think that would be defensible to our taxpayers, is when there is heavy, an area that would be heavy, like industrial, things like that, pushing them closer to the turnpike. That makes sense. I think that's fair. And it's less important for uses like that to be near where houses are. I mean, a lot of retail depends, but a lot of retail wants to be close to where people are. Well, where people are moves and changes, and then they change their mind, and all of a sudden they want to be where they didn't used to want to be because now there's people there. So you are not going to be able to predict it. Give up now is basically what I'm saying.
Okay. And I think that was Councilor McGuire's point, is if past history is any indication, we don't have a good track record.
The only other thing I'd throw into the mix is, and Larry brought this up, and I think someone else did too, is the movement of people in traffic through town. It just all goes through the village, and I honestly think that we have to look to the development of other roadways through town, whether it's through agreements with developers or some other mechanism to move the traffic around town and not just through the village. And I think that if we don't start to think about where that might be possible now, that in 15 years when people want to do it, it's going to be practically impossible or 10 times more expensive. I think there's really only a few possibilities now, to be honest with you. I don't think there's a lot of choices out there, but I'd like to at least ask these two groups to noodle that as well as the other things that we've put on the table, just to get the conversation started in the community.
I think Wiscasset, Gorham, Wyndham all have war stories to tell on that.
The other thing I would look at is your area of concern down in South Gray there. I would look to what our neighboring towns are doing as well. Because I think if you look down there, just over the border is significant residential development already there. It's pretty well developed out. So to me, that might be a driving force to tell us what's coming in that area and match it.
Yep. And we did look at that. One of the interns that Drew actually worked with mapped that out, and that was part of the consideration. I looked at the map that he created that looked at the future land use in the respective municipalities' comp plan together with their existing zoning, and that was part of the equation for proposing the zoning adjacent to all of the municipal property lines. So. Yep. Yep. It may be. Let's see. He's a big shot attorney now, but was it 3 years ago? 2 years ago? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
From having a conversation with the community, a map like that could be valuable too, because
Yep.
adds further justification for the reasoning that's happening here in town.
Yep. We can revisit that map. It looked at all of the abutting municipalities and where they were headed.
I'm wondering if we could also add a layer with existing conserved land and our open space, plan. We keep looking at these as different maps instead of integrating them, and we have this plan.
And that's in process. As I know, Open Space is aware. Kristen and I are actively working on amendments to the subdivision ordinance that include a map, or we're looking for a better title for it, but we're calling it parcels of interest, that will be presumably part of proposed zoning changes to get to the council that requires connectivity between these different nodes. My classic example is if there were a subdivision proposed on a parcel, let's say between Libby Hill and Wilkes Beach, there probably should be a public easement, pedestrian, not motorized, connection somewhere from one side to the other to allow that to happen. And when I was in Standish, we used to call them, we used to require sidewalks, and the argument from the developer was, oh, these are sidewalks to nowhere. Well, eventually they weren't sidewalks to nowhere, and so, and if the town is serious, which I think it is, about implementing the open space plan, then having this provision in the subdivision ordinance, I think, is going to be important, and so that's on the radar. And Chris and I are also actively working on, we're pretty close to going to OAC with it, 3 different types of open space subdivision, what I call small lot subdivisions, regular open space subdivisions, and maybe multifamily, which I know is going to spark a discussion, and should, with the council on where that should be considered.
Just for information, beginning with habitat layers from the Inland Fishery and Wildlife Department, we have layers that will show undeveloped blocks, not by parcels, but just undeveloped blocks. But then we also have a layer that shows all the conserved lands, not just in gray, but all the neighboring towns in the entire state. Maine has some of the highest acreages in conservation type land easements, some of the largest in the world now. In fact, we're in northern Maine, just as a point of interest. But that block of green you see right there is one of the larger undeveloped blocks of Maine, undeveloped blocks of, it's been a long day, undeveloped blocks of land in the area, in Cumberland County probably too. I think that was pointed out by the director from Royal River. Yeah, I think they mentioned that, just as a point of interest. So it's worth considering too.
I'll just note that we learned at our most recent open space committee meeting from the town assessor that there has been a shift in some of those current use tax programs where, you know, they're available for all around the state. There's the tree growth, the farmland, and the open space tax program, that in the past those were a deterrent for development, and the penalties to come out of those programs encourage people to stay in those programs, and that as development pressure is increasing in places like Gray, developers are no longer being deterred by those fees, the penalties to come out of those programs. And so interesting to think about all of this, think about where those parcels are, and think about, like, are we going to inadvertently encourage changes in land use that have been in place for decades, if we're sort of changing the way that they might be able to access development. So just, I don't know the answer. I'm just putting that out there. That was fascinating.
Other comments, Suze?
This is a little bit off the wall, as you might expect. But over the years, in your head, you keep doing the town and what can connect and how can it connect. But I'm wondering now, I just thought of 1 or 2 places where it's further out, and I always wondered why they just left the block right there. So everybody had to come in this way and go back out. Everybody had to come in this way and go back out. And I wonder how many opportunities, and that may not be an opportunity. That may be it's better that they did what they did, but they were 2 different developers and they didn't connect. And I'm just wondering if we know how many of those actual scenarios are out there that could anyway, again, help circulate. We don't know exactly where everybody's going. We think we all going right back and forth like this. Well, no, we're not. We're going here, and then we come back, and then we go out there. I just wonder if you've run across any situations that
Things like a two different residential subdivisions connecting to one another. Is that?
Yes, and I know down to Little Sebago, there's an area where, now if those people are watching, they want to hang me, but it goes just so far in one direction, stops, and then it starts again and comes out around. So I don't know if those are valuable, but I always have found that very fascinating.
Yeah, there's some standards in the subdivision ordinance. Yeah, those are hard. Yeah,
I didn't remember that one.
Yeah,
But I just don't know, just what, I mean, a lot of people here in this room that can run that map if we're in back and forth.
Yeah, the planning board looks at that, at least they try to. There's some standards in the subdivision ordinance about the maximum dead-end road length. There's some standards in subdivision about the maximum number of lots that are served. But of course, and there's also provisions that allow the planning board to require a connector to the abutting piece if it looks like it might be developed. It often runs into civil agreements between the property owners, but it is on the, I can say it's on the radar for planning boards, but it gets complicated with multiple property owners.
Airbnb is complicated, okay? It's my piece of land, stay away.
Yes. So, any other comments here? I hope this was helpful. Hope it was instructive. I'll be working with Al. My thought was that we can get a kind of a condensed version of this with maybe the ability to turn the development constraints on and off type thing, to show the residents that are viewing this from home perhaps what's out there. And ideally, I think we can do this with the ability to zoom into a particular property so they can see where we are. And keep working with OAC on our challenging areas and keep going here. Well, it's perfect audience. Would the planning board like an opportunity to weigh in on how to most effectively solve the white areas on the map?
I would say if we could be invited to those meetings that are gonna, we don't wanna set our own meeting for us. Like, but we could just tag, we could just, I would say, as a member of the planning board, I would be happy to just participate in the meetings that are going to be happening anyway, as we are able. And to the extent that the ordinance gives the planning board options, of course, that only works for ones that come to us. If it doesn't come to us, we can't do anything, but.
Yep, we can do that. Yeah, OAC meetings are online. They're virtual only. Historically they've been Thursdays, and but that would be great. No, this I'd appreciate the input, and again, I hope this was helpful. And it's amazing what GIS can do. I remember watching what it could do very clunkily, invented words again, when I was in grad school, but that was a while ago, and it's come a long way. So we are indeed. So all set? You wanna, okay. Thank you.
I just want to thank you all again for coming. You know, we've been tossing this around as a council and an ordinance advisory committee, but I think it was valuable to have everybody here in the room and looking at the same thing at the same time. Doug, do you have an update on the timeline? I know you want inputs, but what do you? Maybe that's too much of a loaded question. Yeah.
We have an OAC meeting scheduled for this Thursday. I don't know. I haven't polled the group. I don't know if we want to pull it together that quickly, but I would like to think that the next OAC meeting we would let's see, I'm trying to think when that would be, and if we were to give people a little time, if we are going to have a meeting to try to fill in the missing colors. I feel like I'm in a Jackson Brown song. If we're going to have a meeting to fill in the missing colors on the map, would you want to have that meeting in person? Would that be helpful, where we can be interactive with the map, with the development constraints and so forth? Okay, we can do that. So we'll send out a poll that I will work on setting up a meeting in the next 2 weeks or less with anyone that wants to attend. Anyone, OAC, Planning Board, and Open Space, and with the intended purpose to look at the overall map and if there are any questions about that, and then the focus be on trying to come up with what the most effective solution to these areas are, including, per Mike's comment, looking at maybe having some more maybe there are too many districts that are proposed. But I think this at least moves the ball forward. But we'll send. I'll ask Claire to help me with that, and we can set up a time and get the screen share option. I think that's right, and we can zoom in, zoom out, and go from there, if that helps. So.
All right. Thanks again, everybody, and we will adjourn at 7:52 p.m. Thank you.